Hey everyone, welcome to segment 2 of 7 Up. As I mentioned in the first sequence when we had her outside, we've moved her into the shop now, given her a quick wipe down with some wet cloths, cleaned it up a little bit to see where we're at. The surprises that I got, the car's been sitting about 2 years. I wasn't expecting any problems. It got parked when I started undergoing cancer treatment and wasn't going to have time to use the car, so we carefully put it away, pickled everything. And as a result, when I went to start it the other day from segment 1, I was a little surprised that she didn't bark right up. So we're going to have to deal with that, and we've diagnosed it as the fuel pump has failed. We'll show you how we did that in just a few moments. But we've also done a walk around on the car overall, and we're going to share that with you. I've not had it up in the air yet to check the brakes. First thing we want to do is get a good look at the fuel pump problem, get it resolved, and then we're going to deal with the brakes, because they're the two most important things. If it doesn't run, you're not going anywhere, and if it doesn't have brakes, you're going to kill yourself. So those two components are first. But let's take a look at exactly what we're working with. Here we go. So surprising to me, we redid this car about 5 years ago and put a ton of miles on it, especially moving out into the country. And she's developed a few warts. So as I mentioned, we do have a fuel pump issue to deal with. And you can see there's a little bit of fender aging happening there that we're going to have to take care of. But overall, she's lived through things really well. Vinyl top still in good shape after being repainted and refinished. On the back, we do have a couple of small issues. We have, as you can see, a spot where the paint's failed, and it doesn't come out real good here, but we've got a couple that are starting to bubble. So those are things we're going to have to deal with. Nothing serious. On the inside, the seat covers that we used after several years of use are tiring out. So we do want to get the seats recovered when we get into the major upgrades. But a bigger problem right now is the carpet's pulled away. The old contact cement from the factory has finally failed. So another piece we're going to have to deal with, and that's going to mean pulling the seat. But the interior otherwise has aged really well. But that brings us back to the engine bay, which needs a really good cleanup. The battery box and area, of course, they need a really good cleanup from sitting. And we've got to figure out what's happened with the brakes. So let's talk first about the fuel pump and how we know that's the problem for our no start. Okay, here we go in the engine bay. Now, when a vehicle doesn't start and you know the engine's in reasonable condition, there's only two reasons: no fuel or no spark. Now, we immediately went for the fuel because it's the easiest to diagnose the quickest. So what we did was we pulled the air filters and squirted a little bit of fuel into each carburetor, then went to start it, and guess what? Barked right up. So we knew we had spark, but we weren't getting fuel. So we tried that a couple of times, because sometimes it takes a little bit for the fuel pump to prime when it's been sitting. And didn't help. As long as we were bottle feeding it fuel, it'd run, but as soon as we stopped, it wouldn't. So what we ended up doing is starting an inspection of the whole engine bay. And with some assistance, my son turning the engine over for me, what we discovered is, if you look way down in here, throw a little extra light on the subject, we have the fuel pump. And when the fuel pump was spinning over, and you can still see down in here how it's wet with gasoline, when we were spinning it over, what was happening was it was spraying fuel all the way through here. So we checked the hoses, and we checked the feed, and we checked the fuel regulator, which is just back here, and discovered it was not the hoses, it was not a connection, it was not a fuel regulator. It was actually the diaphragm inside the pump had failed and was blowing it out the gasket around the top, so we're not getting any fuel. So how are we going to solve this? Well, pretty easy actually. I happen to have an electric fuel pump, and I'm sick of buying mechanical pumps. It seems like every 2 years the ethanol that's being used in fuel destroys the the diaphragm inside the fuel pump, and I'm kind of tired of that. But I do have an electric fuel pump here that I was going to use for another project. So what we're going to do is run a hose from the fuel supply to an electric fuel pump up here, and then back to the fuel regulator and up to the carburetors. And in doing that, we're going to bypass the mechanical fuel pump. So for the moment, we're just going to bypass, we're not going to worry about it. But when the engine comes out, we start to overhaul it and prepare the next engine to go in, we're going to make a proper fuel block-off plate and put it in place and a couple other things. But seeing as we want to have some fun this summer, we're just going to concentrate on getting her up and running. Now along the way, the other problem we have to deal with is the area around the battery box. Now you can see from sitting, the battery cables are corroded up, got a little bit of corrosion on the battery, and the hold down, etc. is starting to get tacky. So we're going to be pulling the battery out while we're installing the fuel pump and cleaning all of that stuff up, making sure it's shipshape, and checking everything else out in the engine bay. Once we have it running, then we're going to put her up in the air on blocks and start checking out the brakes. So while we start getting organized to do that, we're going to move on and continue to finish the stripping on the parts car. There's not much left. It's time to get it up in the air and drop the engine, transmission, and suspension. So until the next segment in a few days, you take care, enjoy, and thanks for popping in and checking up on 7-Up, and we'll talk to you real soon. Okay, for this second segment, let's just take a quick look at what we've done so far. We've pulled the battery, cleaned up the battery box, cleaned up everything around it, including the coil. We've checked out the hoses and stuff down by the fuel pump. Okay, we've checked over our electrical leads. This clamp has to be replaced. I have one here, so that's not that big a deal. Now, the fuel pump, as you can see way down here, is now mounted, and I have to go get a 4-prong relay so that we can wire it in. But look how it's mounted. It's put well away from the ignition system, most of the wiring, all of that stuff. It's in an area where if there's a leak, it shouldn't be a huge deal. And what we did was use 2 holes that were already there to mount it. Now, this top one right here had to be elongated with a round file. But what it did was it saved me from drilling more holes in this car, and I really hate doing that. So this is all mounted for the moment. We're going to go back, clean everything up, touch up, paint it, make sure that it's rust protected. And in here you can see how we've used galvanized pieces from the back side. And also notice the bolt heads are on this side. So when we twist the tire around, if we have one that's a little bigger, it's not going to hit anything sharp pointing out. These are all things you got to think of when you're putting it together, and especially making a modification. Now, next steps, we have to get a relay and some wiring ends. We have to run a hose from way down here, which is the feed from the tank through the motor mount and up to this end here of the fuel pump, which is the inside. From the outside, it goes back over to here, which is our feed for the carburetor, and that's where our fuel regulator is. So that'll be it for today. We've got cleanup to do. We've got a battery box and a battery to clean up, and I want to get protectant and things on anywhere that it looks like it might ever rust, whether it thinks about it or not, and a little more cleanup to do. And then we'll be back with segment number 3 of 7-Up.